Good morning. I'm so glad you could come pray with me. We are continuing in Richard Foster's book, Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home. These sessions are intended to help us learn about prayer, to deepen our prayer life, and to spend time together in prayer. And today we may well move into 4 minutes of prayer. In the first section we did 3 minutes of prayer, but at the end of this time together we will take 4 minutes of prayer together. The first 7 sessions that we did, the first 7 chapters of Foster's book, we were moving inward, seeking transformation of who we are so that we can be more readily available to communicate and be open to our relationship with God. In this part 2 of his book, we will be moving upward. We are now seeking the intimacy that we need in order to build and deepen our relationship with God. This mutual relationship, it becomes now a much more mutual relationship, more of a friendship is what we're seeking to build, where it's no longer all about us, but we're also seeking to recognize and understand God. And so the first prayer that Foster offers us in this section is the prayer of adoration. But I want to read to you a little bit, just the first paragraph of how he describes this actual section. He says, "We are exiles and aliens until we can come into God, the heart's true home. Pride and fear have kept us at a safe distance. But as the resistance within us is overcome by the operations of faith, hope, and love, we begin moving upward into the divine intimacy. This in turn empowers us for ministry to others." And so this is the prayer of adoration, which Foster describes as this. Prayer is the human response to the perpetual outpouring of love by which God lays siege to every soul. When our reply to God is most direct of all, it is called adoration. Adoration is spontaneous yearning of the heart to worship, honor, magnify, and bless God. So he says that the prayer of adoration is not necessarily a special form of prayer, but rather it's a kind of prayer that sort of saturates all of our prayer time with God. And he points out 2 sides of the prayer of adoration. He says it consists of both thanksgiving and praise. Thanksgiving being those times when we glorify God, excuse me, for what God has done, most often for us personally. And then praise is when we simply glorify God simply for who God is. Of course, there are so many biblical references to praise and adoration. We see so many characters in the Bible lifting up both of these, especially in the Psalms we see these. Foster says, to the extent we can draw a line of demarcation, praise lies on a higher plane than thanksgiving. In his classic work entitled simply Prayer, Ole Halesby observes, "When I give thanks, my thoughts still circle about myself to some extent. But in praise, my soul ascends to self-forgetting adoration, seeing and praising only the majesty and power of God, his grace and redemption." In his book here, Foster also refers to C.S. Lewis, who offers some possible obstacles that we might encounter as we seek the prayer of adoration, those kinds of things that keep us from fully being in that attitude of prayer. The first one that he lists is inattention. And that is basically when we just get so wrapped up in our busy lives and let the world pull us away and draw our attention to other things. And we just kind of forget. We're not paying attention to God and God's movement in our lives. The other is wrong attention. So it is when we actually are focusing on something else. Not that we just fail to focus on God, but we're actually directly focusing on other things. And Foster tells a marvelous story in his book about when he was at a home, and he was conducting worship in someone's home. It was a hot summer evening, and they had the door open, and at some point, Foster suggested that they all stop and just take some time in silent prayer. Well, as they moved into this time of silent prayer, the owner of the house had a cat that was outside, and it started scratching at the door to get in, and scratched at that door the entire time that they had set aside for this prayer. So Foster said it was quite distracting. He couldn't focus on God because all he could think about was this cat scratching at the door. He also said it never occurred to him to just go and let the cat in. But later on that evening, as he was talking with others that were present, they too spoke of the distraction of this cat. But in their midst was a wise missionary. And Foster noticed that he had remained silent during this discussion. And so he asked the missionary, "What are you thinking?" And the missionary said, "I was just thinking about what it was that perhaps God was trying to tell us through that cat." Foster said, "I don't know that the cat was trying to tell us anything, but what the missionary told us was something quite wonderful, that we had allowed something to distract us, to pull our attention away. We were paying attention to the wrong thing." If you've ever had something like this happen to you, you might just put a smiley face or praying hands. That story really resonated with me because I can think of so many times when I've allowed the wrong thing to pull my attention away from what God is doing in my life or speaking over my life. One of the other obstacles that C.S. Lewis lifts up is greed. And that is when we start receiving gifts from God and a connection from God. Instead of reflecting on those and experiencing those, we just start asking for more. Before we can even fully experience what God has given us, we're just asking God to give us something else. And so in that, we fail to then have that attitude of adoration, of thanks and praise, because we're just busy being greedy and wanting more. And the last one C.S. Lewis reflects on is conceit. This is when we start thinking that because God is connecting with us and we are seeing things that others aren't, that somehow we're better than them. It's like, what's wrong with them? Can't they see this? It's so obvious. So this, of course, pulls all the attention back onto ourselves, which is not what adoration of God is. It's more adoration of ourselves. And so that can really block that adoration of God that we are called to. It blocks our heart from being full of that thanksgiving and praise, which we need to have. Foster reminds us that adoration is something we have to learn. It does not come to us naturally. And this brought to mind my own two young granddaughters who are 2 and 5. And no one had to teach them how to ask for things. That came to them quite naturally, and still does. But my son and daughter-in-law have been very intentional about teaching the girls to say thank you. And it's amazing how people outside the family, if we're out somewhere, will comment on this when the girls say thank you, like in a restaurant or something like that. They're just so amazed because it's not something they see regularly, because it doesn't come naturally in us. And so to see these small children actually having an attitude of gratitude and being thankful is quite refreshing. And they are learning to have grateful hearts, which is quite nice. And so Foster offers us some stepping stones to, again, move upward and get that intimacy with God through prayer of adoration. The first is our attention, how to focus our attention on the simple things that God has placed in our lives, the tiny little bits of creation that surround us. And in his book, he talks mostly about being outside and enjoying the outdoors. But if you're not able to do that, you can look out your window and see things, or you could enjoy a pet or a plant or something that's inside, or just the light as it streams through the window. Notice the intricacy of the clouds, the subtle blues and grays, even on a cloudy day, how magnificent it is what God has done in the world. This brought to mind for me a book that we studied in a Sunday school class years ago called Some People Feel the Rain While Others Just Get Wet. And so that's what he's talking about, is when we truly experience the beauty of nature, the intricacy of God, and how present God is around us. Even just breathing in and feeling and recognizing the breath as it enters our body and what that feels like. Not to scrutinize, not to analyze, not to learn, but simply to experience. And Foster says this: when we do these kinds of things with some degree of regularity, we in time begin to experience pleasures rather than merely scrutinize them. What this does within us is altogether wonderful. We are first drawn into these tiny pleasures and then beyond them to the giver of pleasures. As this happens, thanksgiving and praise and adoration will flow naturally in their proper time. The next stepping stone he offers is what he says Sue Monk Kidd calls the grateful center, or what I would call our quiet center. It's when we are able to quiet ourselves, get ourselves kind of out of the way, and truly experience and enjoy that which God is giving us. Enjoy and observe God in us, through us, around us, and just enjoy that. But we have to get to that quiet center quite often and to fully be able to do that. Another stepping stone he offers is the practice of gratitude. And again, this is something that we have to learn. And some people, I think, are able to move into that space more easily than others. For those that really struggle with an attitude of gratitude, then I often recommend maybe keeping a grateful journal or a blessing journal, where you just challenge yourself to write down somewhere at least 3 things at the end of each day that you are grateful for, that you found a blessing in. And as you do that, then you find that you start beginning to look for those things. And so it helps your focus on those things. And as you are focusing on them, then you can have more of that attitude of gratitude. As we move across these stepping stones of our attention and our quiet center and our attitude of gratitude, then we can finally get to that stepping stone where we are magnifying God. And all too often what we want to magnify in our lives is our own troubles and trifles, but we cannot magnify God too much. God is truly mysterious and magnificent, and so it's just building something up even larger than we first perceived it to be. That's how we magnify something, right? And so we just spend that time magnifying God, glorifying God in our praise, in our worship. We get to a point where we have celebratory worship, where we can sing and dance and shout, laugh, and really enjoy God's presence in our lives as we worship. We get to where Mary was when the angel told her that she would bear the Son of God. Our soul magnifies our God. And so, as we have moved into this second section of Foster's book, we are going to spend 4 minutes in prayer. We're inching our way up. Again, this extra minute may seem like a lifetime for some of us that have not had much experience with silent prayer, but that's what we're going to do. We're just going to sit and be intentional in experiencing God in these 4 minutes. I will strike 3 tones that will begin our time of prayer, and I will strike 3 tones that will end our time of prayer as well in that 4 minutes. And what I encourage you to do today as a way of adoration is simply focus on the sounds that you hear. We already have some nature sounds, and there'll be some music added to this. Listen to them not to analyze them or scrutinize them, the word that Foster uses, but simply to experience God within them. And you might, as we begin the time, just ask God, show me your heart in this time. Help me experience your heart through this music, through these sounds of these creatures you have created. So let us now go to God in prayer, and I will close our time then with Foster's prayer.
As you seek to offer prayers of adoration, if you don't have the opportunity to get outside and enjoy nature, there are all kinds of YouTube videos, which is what we are actually listening to. If you were able to see what I see, you would also see some beautiful nature scenes. And so you might look for something like that to just sit and spend time paying attention to God's amazing handiwork in this world, to offer thanksgiving and praise. And so we'll close our time with Foster's prayer that closes this chapter. And next week we will continue to move upward in seeking intimacy with God. Will you pray with me? O most high, glorious God, how great is my dilemma. In your awful presence, silence seems best. And yet, if I keep my peace, the rocks themselves will cry out. But if I do speak, what will I say? It is love that calls forth my speech. So it's love you. Lord God, I adore you. I bow down before you. Thank you for your gifts of grace, the consistency of sunrise and sunset, the wonder of colors, the solace of voices I know. I magnify you, Lord. Let me see your greatness to the extent that I can receive it. Help me bow in your presence in endless wonder and ceaseless praise. In the name of him whose adoration never failed. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you again that you have come to pray with me today. May the Lord bless you and keep you in this week as you seek to lift your prayers of adoration, of thanks and praise to our magnificent, almighty,
powerful, and amazingly loving God. Blessings on your week. Amen.